There have been moments in human history when the fate of the entire world rested on the decision of a single person. Not a president, not a general with stars on his shoulders, not a diplomat negotiating in some gilded conference room. Just an ordinary person, a mid-level officer sitting at a console, a submarine commander deep beneath the ocean, a radar operator staring at a screen in the middle of the night. We don't learn about these moments in school. They don't appear in most history books. They weren't announced on the evening news when they happened, because almost nobody knew they had happened at all. The documents were classified. The participants were sworn to secrecy. The governments involved had every reason to pretend that everything was under control, that the systems designed to prevent nuclear war were working exactly as intended. They weren't. What I'm going to tell you is not a conspiracy theory. These are documented incidents, acknowledged by governments, verified by declassified files and the testimony of the people who lived through them. Some of these stories only became public decades after they occurred. Others are still not widely known, even though they represent moments when human civilization came within minutes, sometimes seconds, of ending. The terrifying truth is this: during the Cold War, the world nearly destroyed itself not once, not twice, but repeatedly. And in almost every case, the catastrophe was averted not by the wisdom of leaders or the reliability of technology, but by the judgment of individuals who chose in the critical moment to trust their instincts over their orders, their humanity over their training. One mistake, one wrong decision, one moment of panic instead of clarity. That's all it would have taken. This is the story of those moments, and the people who saved the world without anyone knowing. September 26, 1983, Serpukhov 15, Soviet Union. It was just past midnight when the alarms began to scream. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was 44 years old, an engineer by training, and he was not supposed to be on duty that night. The regular shift commander had called in sick, and Petrov had been pulled in as a replacement. He was sitting in the command center of Serpukhov 15, a secret bunker south of Moscow that served as the nerve center for the Soviet Union's early warning satellite system. The system was called OKO, I in Russian, and it was designed to detect American intercontinental ballistic missiles at the moment of launch. The satellites would spot the infrared signature of the rocket engines, and within seconds, the warning would flash on Petrov's screen. He would then have minutes, perhaps 5, perhaps less, to verify the data and report up the chain of command. The Soviet leadership would have to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike before American warheads began detonating on Soviet soil. This was the logic of mutually assured destruction, the doctrine that had governed superpower relations for decades. Both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. The only thing preventing either side from launching a first strike was the certainty that the other side would retaliate. To make this threat credible, both sides maintained systems designed to detect an incoming attack and respond before it was too late. The system was supposed to guarantee survival. In practice, it meant that the fate of humanity depended on whether a few people in underground bunkers could correctly interpret the data on their screens in a matter of minutes. At 12:14 a.m. Moscow time, the screen in front of Petrov lit up with a single word in large red letters: launch. The computer was reporting that an American Minuteman ICBM had been launched from a base in Montana. The satellite had detected the infrared signature. The trajectory was confirmed. The missile was heading toward the Soviet Union. Petrov's training was clear. He was supposed to report the launch immediately to his superiors. The information would go up the chain of command, all the way to the Soviet leadership. Given the political situation, and I will explain in a moment just how dangerous that situation was, there was every reason to believe that the leadership would order a retaliatory strike. This is not a theory about what might have happened. This is what the system was designed to do. This is what decades of military planning had prepared for. A first strike detected, a retaliatory launch ordered, and then, within an hour or so, hundreds of millions of people dead, civilization in ruins, nuclear winter descending on a poisoned planet. Petrov hesitated. Context. Why 1983 was the most dangerous year? To understand why this moment was so terrifying, you have to understand what was happening in the world in September 1983. The Cold War had entered what many historians now consider its most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, pursuing a policy of aggressive confrontation with the Soviet Union. He had called the USSR an evil empire and was overseeing the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. American missiles were being deployed in Western Europe, just minutes of flight time from Soviet cities. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, threatened to upset the balance of mutual assured destruction. The Soviet leadership was old, sick, and paranoid. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief who had become General Secretary, was convinced that the United States was preparing a nuclear first strike. Soviet intelligence had launched Operation Ryan, an unprecedented effort to detect signs of an imminent American attack. KGB officers around the world were ordered to report anything that might indicate preparations for war. The atmosphere in the Kremlin was one of deep, almost pathological suspicion. And then, just 3 weeks before Petrov's night shift, the Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007. The Boeing 747, carrying 269 passengers and crew, including a United States congressman, had strayed into Soviet airspace over Sakhalin Island. Soviet fighters intercepted it and, after a confused sequence of events, shot it down with air-to-air missiles. Everyone on board was killed. The international reaction was ferocious. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. Relations between the superpowers collapsed to their lowest point in decades. Soviet leaders, meanwhile, believed that the aircraft had been on a spy mission and that the American response was hypocritical propaganda designed to prepare public opinion for war. This was the atmosphere on September 26, 1983, when the alarms went off in Serpukhov 15. This was the context in which Stanislav Petrov had to decide whether the world was about to end. The screen showed 1 missile. Then, within minutes, 4 more. The system was now reporting 5 ICBMs inbound from the United States. Petrov's console was telling him that nuclear war had begun. He had perhaps 5 minutes to act, maybe less. The missiles would reach Soviet territory in about 20 minutes. If his superiors were going to order a retaliatory strike, they needed to know immediately. Every second of delay reduced the time available for decision-making at the top. And yet, Petrov did not pick up the phone. Something felt wrong. He couldn't articulate it precisely in the moment, but his engineer's instincts were screaming at him that this wasn't right. First, why only 5 missiles? If the United States was launching a first strike, they wouldn't send 5 missiles. They would send hundreds, thousands, everything they had all at once to overwhelm Soviet defenses and destroy the capacity to retaliate. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. Second, the system was new. It had been operational for less than a year. Petrov knew, because he had been involved in its development, that it had bugs. The software was imperfect. The satellites were not as reliable as the military brass wanted to believe. Third, the ground-based radar systems were not showing anything. If American missiles were really in the air, the over-the-horizon radars should have detected them. They were not detecting anything. Petrov made his decision. He reported a system malfunction. He did not report a missile launch. He told his superiors that the satellite system was malfunctioning, that the alarm was false. He did this without authorization, without certainty, on nothing more than his own judgment and his gut feeling that something was wrong with the data. He had about 5 minutes to make this decision. 5 minutes to decide whether to start the process that would end the world, or to trust his instincts and hope he wasn't making a catastrophic mistake. He chose to trust himself. Petrov was right. The satellite system had malfunctioned. The warning had been caused by a rare alignment of sunlight, reflecting off high-altitude clouds above the American missile fields. The system's sensors interpreted this reflection as the infrared signature of a missile launch. There were no missiles. There was no attack. The world had come to the brink of nuclear war because of sunlight and clouds. You might expect that Petrov would have been hailed as a hero. He wasn't. The Soviet military was embarrassed by the failure of their expensive new satellite system. Petrov's actions had exposed a flaw that the brass would have preferred to keep hidden. He was not punished exactly, but he was not promoted either. He was quietly reassigned and eventually retired from the military. The incident was classified. For years, almost nobody knew it had happened. Petrov didn't talk about it. The Soviet government certainly didn't talk about it. The story only became public in 1998, when a retired Soviet general mentioned it in his memoirs. By then, the Cold War was over. But the lesson remained. The world survived September 26, 1983, because one man decided not to believe his computer. Stanislav Petrov died in 2017 in a small apartment outside Moscow. He never received any official recognition from the Russian government. A few Western organizations gave him awards. A documentary was made about him. But he remained largely unknown. A footnote in a history that most people don't know almost ended that night. If Petrov's story is obscure, the Cuban Missile Crisis is famous. Everyone knows the broad outlines. The Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Kennedy demanded they be removed. The world held its breath for 13 days. And eventually, Khrushchev backed down. Crisis averted. Diplomacy triumphed. The system worked. That's the version you learn in school. It's not wrong exactly. But it leaves out the moment when the crisis came closest to becoming a catastrophe. A moment that happened not in the White House or the Kremlin, but in a Soviet submarine deep beneath the waves of the Caribbean Sea. And once again, the fate of the world came down to the decision of one man. In October 1962, the Soviet Navy had deployed 4 diesel-electric submarines to Cuba as part of the operation to install nuclear missiles on the island. These were Foxtrot-class attack submarines, cramped and primitive by modern standards, designed for operations in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The Caribbean was a nightmare for them. The water was warm, which meant the cooling systems struggled, and the submarines had to surface frequently to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. What the Americans didn't know, what almost nobody knew, even within the Soviet military, was that each of these submarines was armed with a nuclear torpedo. These were not strategic weapons like the ICBMs that would later dominate Cold War nightmares. They were tactical nuclear weapons, designed to destroy American aircraft carriers and naval formations. Each torpedo carried a warhead equivalent to roughly 10 kilotons of TNT, about 2/3 the size of the Hiroshima bomb. Not enough to destroy a city, but more than enough to vaporize a naval task force. The submarines had orders to use these weapons if attacked, or if they lost contact with Moscow and concluded that war had begun. The decision to launch did not require authorization from the Kremlin. It could be made by the submarine commanders themselves. On October 27, 1962, the day that historians now call Black Saturday, one of these submarines, B-59, found itself in an impossible situation. The submarine was being hunted by the United States Navy. American destroyers and aircraft had established a blockade around Cuba, and they were actively searching for Soviet submarines. They had found B-59 and were determined to force it to the surface. To do this, they were dropping practice depth charges, small explosive devices designed to signal the submarine that it had been detected, not to destroy it. But the crew of B-59 didn't know they were practice charges. Deep underwater, with their batteries nearly exhausted and their air supply running low, the crew heard explosions all around them. The temperature inside the submarine had risen above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high. Men were fainting at their stations. They had been underwater for days, unable to surface, unable to communicate with Moscow, unable to know what was happening in the world above. For all they knew, World War III had already started. Captain Valentin Savitsky was in command of B-59. He was exhausted, disoriented, and convinced that the Americans were trying to sink his ship. He decided to fight back. "We're going to blast them now," he reportedly said. "We will die, but we will sink them all." "We will not disgrace our Navy." He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. On most Soviet submarines, the captain had the authority to launch weapons. But B-59 was not a normal submarine. It was the flagship of the small flotilla, which meant it carried an additional senior officer, Captain Second Rank Vasily Arkhipov, the chief of staff for the entire submarine brigade. Under the rules governing the nuclear torpedoes, all three senior officers on the submarine, Captain Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and Arkhipov, had to agree before a nuclear weapon could be launched. Two of the three were ready to fire. Maslenikov had agreed with Savitsky. Arkhipov said no. We don't know exactly what he said. The accounts vary and the participants' memories differed, but we know that Arkhipov argued against launching. He pointed out that they didn't actually know what was happening on the surface. They had no confirmation that war had begun. The depth charges might be signals, not attacks. Surfacing and establishing communication was the right course of action, not starting a nuclear war on the basis of incomplete information. The argument was heated. Savitsky was furious, but Arkhipov would not budge. Eventually, B-59 surfaced. The Americans did not attack. The submarine was allowed to withdraw. The crisis, though no one knew it at the time, had passed its most dangerous moment. Let's be clear about what was at stake. If Arkhipov had agreed, if B-59 had launched its nuclear torpedo at the American ships above, the result would have been the destruction of at least one US Navy vessel, possibly more. Hundreds or thousands of American sailors would have been killed in a nuclear explosion. The United States would have responded. In the climate of October 1962, with American forces already at DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war, and with a Soviet nuclear attack on the US Navy, the response would almost certainly have been massive. American nuclear bombers were already in the air, waiting for the order to proceed to their targets. The missiles in Turkey and Italy were ready to launch, and the Soviets would have responded to that. And then, in 2002, on the 40th anniversary of the crisis, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara attended a conference in Havana where he met with Cuban and Soviet veterans of those events. When he learned about the nuclear torpedoes, which the US government had not known about in 1962, he was visibly shaken. "We came very close," he said. "Much closer than I had known." Vasily Arkhipov was never famous during his lifetime. He continued his naval career, eventually rising to the rank of Vice Admiral. He died in 1998, just as the first accounts of his role in the crisis were beginning to emerge. In 2017, the year Stanislav Petrov died, a group of scholars named Arkhipov as the man who saved the world. It's not an exaggeration. If he had said yes instead of no, you would not be reading this. None of us would be here. So far, I've told you about Soviet officers who saved the world. But it would be a mistake to think that only one side made errors, that only one side's systems failed. The truth is that the American nuclear warning systems experienced their own terrifying malfunctions, incidents that came within minutes of triggering a launch sequence that could have ended civilization. These are not conspiracy theories. These incidents are documented in declassified government records. Some were acknowledged by officials at the time. Others only became public decades later. All of them should make you deeply uncomfortable about the systems we built to keep us safe. At 8:50 a.m. on November 9, 1979, the screens at NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, buried deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, suddenly showed a nightmare scenario: a massive Soviet nuclear attack on the United States. The displays indicated that Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles were streaking toward the American coastline. Then came the ICBMs, hundreds of them, rising from their silos in Siberia and arcing over the North Pole. This was it, the bolt from the blue first strike that American military planners had feared for decades. Within seconds, the warning was flashed to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon and to the alternate National Military Command Center at Fort Ritchie in Maryland. The President IS Airborne Command Post, the Doomsday Plane, was ordered into the air. Nuclear-armed B-52 bombers began starting their engines, preparing to take off and head toward their fail-safe points. Fighter jets scrambled from bases across the country. The United States had minutes to decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. Fortunately, someone thought to check the other warning systems. The satellites weren't showing anything. The ground-based radars weren't showing anything. If hundreds of Soviet missiles were really in the air, every sensor would be screaming. Only NORAD's computers were showing an attack. The warning was cancelled. The bombers were recalled. The fighters were stood down. The investigation revealed what had happened. A technician had accidentally loaded a training tape into the operational computer system. The tape contained a realistic simulation of a Soviet first strike, designed to test how operators would respond in a real emergency. But the simulation had been fed into the live system, and the computers couldn't tell the difference between a training scenario and reality. A training exercise, loaded into the wrong computer, nearly started World War III. The incident lasted only 6 minutes. But in those 6 minutes, the machinery of nuclear war was set in motion. Bombers prepared to fly. Missiles prepared to launch. Decisions were nearly made that could not have been unmade. 7 months later, it happened again. At 2:26 a.m. on June 3, 1980, the warning displays at NORAD showed a Soviet submarine-launched missile attack. Then, the display changed. 220 Soviet ICBMs inbound. Then, it changed again. Different numbers, different trajectories, the data flickering and shifting. Once again, the bombers prepared to launch. Once again, the President's Airborne Command Post took off. Once again, the military command structure went to alert. And once again, the other sensors showed nothing. The satellites saw no launches. The radars detected no missiles. The warning was false. 3 days later, on June 6th, the same thing happened. More false warnings, more alerts, more preparations for a war that wasn't happening. This time, the investigation found the culprit, a single integrated circuit chip in the computer system. The chip had failed, and its failure caused the computer to generate random numbers that were interpreted as missile detections. The chip cost 46 cents. A 46-cent computer chip, malfunctioning in the night, brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Twice. After these incidents, the Air Force conducted a review and found that NORAD's computers had generated 151 false alarms in an 18-month period. Most were quickly identified as errors. But not all of them. And in the nuclear age, most is not good enough. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russia and the United States were no longer enemies. The danger had passed, right? On January 25, 1995, scientists in Norway launched a research rocket to study the aurora borealis, the northern lights. The rocket was large, it needed to reach high altitude, and it followed a trajectory that carried it toward Russian airspace. Russian early warning radars detected the launch, and to the radar operators, the rocket looked very much like an American Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile, the kind of weapon that might be used to launch a decapitating first strike against Russian leadership. The warning went up the chain of command. President Boris Yeltsin was informed and was, for the first time ever, the Russian nuclear briefcase, the Cheget, equivalent to the American football, was activated. Yeltsin had minutes to decide whether to order a retaliatory launch. He didn't. He waited. The rocket completed its trajectory and fell into the sea. It was, of course, exactly what the Norwegian government had said it was, a scientific research rocket. Norway had even notified Russia of the launch in advance, but the notification had somehow failed to reach the radar operators or the military command structure. 4 years after the Cold War ended, a scientific experiment nearly triggered a nuclear war because a memo didn't reach the right desk. This incident is particularly chilling because it happened in peacetime, between countries that were no longer adversaries. It demonstrated that the infrastructure of nuclear annihilation remained in place, ready to be triggered by mistake, long after the political conflict that created it had ended. You might think these stories are relics of history. The Cold War is over. Relations between nuclear powers are different now. Surely we fixed the problems, updated the systems, eliminated the risks that brought us so close to destruction. We haven't. The fundamental architecture of nuclear deterrence remains essentially unchanged since the 1960s. The basic logic is the same. Each side maintains the ability to destroy the other, and this mutual threat of annihilation is supposed to prevent either side from starting a war. To make this threat credible, each side must be able to detect an incoming attack and launch a retaliatory strike before its own missiles are destroyed. This means the systems must be fast, and the decisions must be made in minutes. This logic creates the very dangers that almost destroyed us. Consider the timeline of a nuclear attack. An intercontinental ballistic missile takes about 30 minutes to travel from Russia to the United States. A submarine-launched missile, fired from closer range, might take 15 minutes or less. A missile from a submarine close to the coast might give only 5 or 6 minutes of warning. In that time, the warning must be received, verified, and communicated up the chain of command. The president must be located and informed. A decision must be made. Orders must be transmitted. Missiles must be launched. This is not enough time for careful deliberation. It is not enough time to verify that the warning is real. It is not enough time to consider alternatives, to attempt diplomacy, to do anything except react according to pre-planned procedures. The system is designed this way deliberately. The whole point of maintaining a launch on warning capability is to ensure that retaliation is guaranteed even if the enemy's first strike is successful. But this design creates an inherent vulnerability to false alarms, misunderstandings, and accidents. We have built a system where the decision to end civilization must be made in less time than it takes to order a pizza. Modern nuclear command and control systems rely heavily on computers and automation. Satellites watch for missile launches. Radars track objects in the sky. Computers analyze the data and generate warnings. Humans are supposed to make the final decisions, but humans are increasingly dependent on machines to tell them what is happening. As we've seen, those machines fail. They generate false alarms, they misinterpret data, they mistake sunlight for rocket engines, training tapes for real attacks, scientific rockets for nuclear missiles. And as the systems become more complex, the opportunities for failure multiply. There's also a deeper problem. In the time available, those 5 or 15 or 30 minutes, there is enormous pressure to trust the machines. A human operator who second-guesses the computer risks being wrong. If the warning is real and you hesitate, your country is destroyed. The institutional incentives push toward believing the machines, not questioning them. Stanislav Petrov was exceptional precisely because he didn't trust the machine. He had the knowledge, the judgment, and the courage to recognize that the computer was wrong. But we cannot design a system that depends on having a Stanislav Petrov on duty at the critical moment. That's not a system. That's luck. But if we can't trust machines, can we trust humans? The evidence is not reassuring. Humans under stress make mistakes. They see patterns that aren't there. They panic. They follow procedures when they should question them, and question procedures when they should follow them. They are subject to fatigue, illness, ideology, and fear. Captain Savitsky, in that submarine in 1962, was ready to launch a nuclear torpedo because he was exhausted, oxygen deprived, and convinced that war had already begun. His judgment was compromised by the conditions he was operating under. If Arkhipov hadn't been there to stop him, his compromised judgment would have ended the world. We also know, from historical records, that both American and Soviet leaders sometimes considered launching nuclear wars preventively. Curtis LeMay, the commander of the Strategic Air Command, repeatedly advocated for a first strike against the Soviet Union. Some Soviet military officers had similar views about the United States. The fact that cooler heads prevailed is reassuring, but it's not a guarantee. Human beings are not reliably rational. The systems we have built assume that they are. All of the incidents I've described occurred in a context of political tension. The Petrov incident happened during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, by definition, a crisis. The false alarms of 1979 and 1980 came during a period of renewed confrontation between the superpowers. When political tensions are high, the threshold for believing a warning goes down. Leaders who already suspect the enemy of hostile intentions are more likely to interpret ambiguous information as confirmation of those suspicions. The system becomes more brittle, more prone to catastrophic failure, precisely when the danger is greatest. We are not living in a time of low political tension. The relationship between the United States and Russia is worse than it has been since the Cold War. China is rising as a nuclear power. New nuclear states have emerged. The architecture of arms control that once limited the danger has been dismantled piece by piece. The world still lives in a condition where one mistake could end everything. We have simply chosen to stop thinking about it. Let me tell you what these stories have in common. In each case, the systems worked exactly as they were designed to work. The satellites detected what they thought were missile launches. The radars tracked what they thought were incoming warheads. The computers generated warnings. The procedures were followed. The chain of command was activated. The systems didn't fail. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. The problem was that what they were supposed to do was wrong. And in each case, disaster was averted not because the system caught its own mistake, but because a human being, Petrov, Arkhipov, anonymous radar operators at NORAD, decided to exercise judgment rather than follow procedure. Stanislav Petrov was supposed to report a missile launch. He didn't, because his instincts told him the data was wrong. Vasily Arkhipov was supposed to agree with his captain and authorize the nuclear torpedo. He didn't, because he believed there had to be another explanation. The people at NORAD were supposed to trust their computers. They didn't, because the other sensors weren't confirming the warning. In every case, the world was saved by someone who broke the rules, who trusted their own judgment over the machinery and the procedures, who said wait when everything was screaming go. That's not a safety system. That's a miracle, repeated just enough times for us to still be here. We have built a world where the decision to end human civilization can be made in minutes based on ambiguous data under conditions of extreme stress by people who may be exhausted, frightened, or misinformed. We have built machines that cannot distinguish between reality and simulation, between a scientific rocket and a nuclear missile. We have created institutions that punish caution and reward rapid response, that make it dangerous to wait and verify before acting. And we have told ourselves that this system keeps us safe. It doesn't. It never did. The safety we have enjoyed for the past 70 years is not the product of a well-designed system. It is the product of luck and of individual human beings who, at the critical moment, chose humanity over protocol. The Third World War didn't start, not because the system worked, but because specific people made specific choices in specific moments. Petrov chose not to report. Arkhipov chose not to agree. Radar operators chose to double-check before panicking. The next time, we might not be so fortunate. These are not comfortable stories. They don't fit neatly into the narratives we tell ourselves about the Cold War, about nuclear deterrence, about the wisdom of our leaders and the reliability of our institutions. They suggest that we are alive today, not because of the systems we built, but despite them. The men who saved us, Petrov, Arkhipov, and others whose names we will never know, were not celebrated in their own time. They didn't receive medals or monuments. Most of them went to their graves with their stories untold, their contributions unknown. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes in the conventional sense, not as warriors who defeated enemies in battle, but as something rarer and more important. People who in a moment of impossible pressure found the clarity and courage to do nothing, to wait, to doubt, to refuse. In a world where one mistake could end everything, the greatest heroism may simply be the wisdom to pause. We are still living in that world. The missiles are still in their silos. The submarines are still on patrol. The computers are still watching the skies, ready to generate warnings that humans must interpret in minutes. Somewhere tonight, someone is sitting at a console, looking at a screen, wondering if this blip, this signal, this anomaly is real or a false alarm. They have minutes to decide. Maybe less. Our survival depends on their judgment. It always has. Let's hope they make the right choice.